In the quiet years between 1870 and the early part of the 1900s, families lived in homes that were neither grand nor particularly small, and they spent their days doing the same sorts of things over and over again, in a rhythm that followed the seasons and the daylight and the gentle turning of ordinary time. The morning would begin slowly, with someone waking before the others, perhaps a mother or a father, and they would move through the dim rooms with careful steps, not rushing, just moving from one task to the next in the way that people do when they have done these things many times before and will do them many times again. They would walk to the kitchen, where the stove stood cold and quiet from the night, and they would open the heavy door of the stove and look inside at the ashes from yesterday's fire, all gray and soft and still. Then they would begin the process of building a new fire, taking small pieces of kindling from the wood box that sat beside the stove, arranging them carefully, one piece at a time, in a pattern that would help the fire catch and grow. This was not exciting work, just the simple placement of wood, the striking of a match, the waiting for the small flames to appear and spread slowly through the kindling, making gentle crackling sounds that were barely sounds at all, more like whispers than anything else. While the fire grew, they might fill the kettle with water from the pump, which required walking to wherever the pump was located. Sometimes inside the house in a small room, sometimes just outside the back door, and working the handle up and down, in a steady rhythm until the water flowed out in a clear, cool stream that filled the kettle slowly. The handle of the pump was usually smooth from years of hands holding it, pushing it down and pulling it up, and the motion was so familiar that it required no thought at all, just the gentle repetition of the movement. With the kettle filled and placed on the warming stove, there was time to stand and wait, looking out the window, perhaps, at the morning light that came gradually, making the shapes of trees and fences and neighboring houses appear bit by bit from the darkness. In the summer months, the light came early, and in the winter months, it came late, and this was simply how things were, year after year, with the family adjusting their waking and sleeping to match the sun without thinking very much about it. Other members of the family would wake slowly, one at a time, and come downstairs or into the kitchen area, moving quietly because that was how mornings were, a quiet time before the day truly began. Children would sit at the table, waiting for breakfast, perhaps looking at their hands, or at the grain pattern in the wooden table, or at nothing in particular, just sitting and being there while the smell of cooking food began to fill the room. Breakfast in these years was often simple, perhaps porridge made from oats that had been stored in a large container in the pantry. The oats poured into a pot with milk or water, stirred slowly over the heat of the stove until they softened and became warm and thick. The stirring required attention, but not much thought, just a hand holding a wooden spoon, moving it around and around through the mixture, watching it change from hard and grainy to soft and smooth, steam rising gently from the surface of the pot. After breakfast was eaten, slowly and quietly, with the family sitting together at the table, there were dishes to wash. This meant carrying the plates and cups and bowls to a basin, which might be on a counter or on a separate table, and heating water in another kettle on the stove, then pouring the warm water into the basin, along with small scraps of soap. The washing of dishes was done one piece at a time, dipping it into the soapy water, rubbing it with a cloth until it felt clean and smooth, then rinsing it in another basin of clear water and setting it aside to dry on a folded towel. The morning hours would continue with various small tasks that needed doing. In households during this time, there was always laundry to consider, though it was not done every day as it would be in later times. When laundry day came, which might be once a week, usually on a Monday, it was a slow and patient process that took much of the day. Water would need to be heated, many kettles full, and poured into a large tub or basin, and then the clothes and linens would be placed in the water, a few items at a time, and left to soak for a while, just sitting there in the warm water, becoming heavy and dark with wetness. After soaking, each piece would be lifted out, dripping, and scrubbed against a washboard, which was a wooden frame with a ribbed metal surface, and the cloth would be rubbed up and down over these ribs, while soap helped to release the dirt and stains. This scrubbing was not vigorous or forceful, just steady and continuous, the same motion repeated many times, with the person doing the washing perhaps looking out a window at the same time, or thinking about what to prepare for the midday meal, or not thinking of much at all. Once the washing was finished, the wringing would begin, taking each wet piece and twisting it tightly to squeeze out as much water as possible, feeling the water run down into the basin below, the fabric becoming lighter and slightly less heavy, though still quite damp. Then each piece would be carried outside if the weather was fair, or hung on drying racks inside if it was raining or cold. And the person carrying the wash would move slowly, with measured steps, hanging each item on the clothesline with wooden pins, spacing them evenly, smoothing out the wrinkles with their hands in a gesture that was both practical and somehow comforting. The clothesline would be strung between two posts in the yard, or between the house and a tree, and the clothes would hang there for hours, moving slightly in any breeze, drying gradually in the sun and air. Watching clothes dry was not something most people did deliberately, but they might glance out at them from time to time throughout the day, noting in a distant way whether they seemed dry yet or not, whether they might need to stay out a bit longer. Between the larger tasks like laundry, there were smaller tasks that filled the hours. Sweeping floors was done often with a broom made of bound straw or other plant materials, pushing dust and small bits of dirt toward the door, gathering it into a small pile, then sweeping it into a dustpan and carrying it outside to shake into the yard. The motion of sweeping was rhythmic and required very little attention, just the back and forth movement of the broom across the wooden boards or the linoleum that some homes had, a soft swishing sound that was repeated over and over in every room. Dusting was another task that appeared regularly, using a soft cloth to wipe surfaces where dust had settled, moving the cloth slowly over tables, over shelves, over the tops of picture frames and door ledges, picking up the fine gray particles that accumulated constantly, no matter how often they were removed. The person dusting might pause occasionally to look at an object they were cleaning, a small dish or a book or a framed photograph, holding it for a moment before setting it back down and continuing with the cloth. The middle part of the day would involve preparing the noon meal, which some families called dinner, and this preparation was similar to the preparation of breakfast, but perhaps included more steps. Vegetables might need to be peeled, which meant sitting at the table or on a chair near the kitchen, holding a potato or a carrot in one hand and a small knife in the other, carefully removing the outer skin in long, thin strips that fell into a bowl or a container set aside for scraps. Each vegetable was peeled slowly and completely, then rinsed under cold water from the pump, and set aside until it was time to cook them. Cooking vegetables meant cutting them into pieces, which was done on a wooden cutting board. the knife moving down through the firm flesh of the vegetable, making it into smaller portions that would cook more evenly. The pieces would be placed in a pot with water and set on the stove to boil, and then there would be more waiting, more standing or sitting nearby, listening to the sound of water beginning to bubble, watching small wisps of steam escape from the pot. Bread was something that many families made themselves in these years, though not necessarily every day. Making bread began with measuring flour from a large bag or bin, scooping it with a cup, and leveling it off, pouring it into a large bowl. Then other ingredients would be added, salt and yeast, and sometimes a bit of sugar or honey, and warm water or milk would be poured in slowly, and everything would be stirred together until it formed a shaggy mass. The kneading of bread dough was a task that took time, perhaps 10 or 15 minutes, pushing the dough down and away with the heels of both hands, folding it back over itself, turning it a quarter turn, and pushing again, over and over, feeling the texture change gradually under the hands, becoming smoother and more elastic, less sticky and more cohesive. The person kneading might count the motions in their head, or might simply let their hands move in the familiar pattern, not counting or thinking, just doing. After kneading, the dough would be shaped into a ball and placed in the bowl, covered with a cloth, and left to rise, which meant sitting undisturbed in a warm place for an hour or more, doing nothing, just quietly expanding as the yeast worked through it. During this rising time, other tasks could be done, but slowly, with part of the mind always aware that the dough was there, waiting, changing in its own time. When the rising was complete, the dough would be shaped into loaves, placed in pans, and left to rise again, another period of waiting, and then finally baked in the oven of the stove, which had been kept at a steady heat through the careful addition of wood to the fire. The smell of baking bread would fill the house gradually, becoming stronger and more present, and eventually the loaves would be removed, brown and firm, set on a rack to cool, and the cycle would be complete until it was time to make bread again. Afternoons in these households were often devoted to mending or sewing, tasks that required good light and a place to sit comfortably. Mending meant examining clothes and linens for small tears or worn spots, threading a needle with thread that matched the fabric as closely as possible, and making small stitches to close a seam or reinforce a weak area. The needle would go in and out of the fabric in a regular pattern, pulling the thread through. The person sewing keeping the stitches small and even, not hurrying, just maintaining a steady pace. Sewing new items, whether a simple apron or a nightgown or a shirt, required cutting fabric according to a pattern, which was often a paper pattern that had been used before, or sometimes no pattern at all, just measurements taken with a cloth tape measure and marks made with chalk. The cutting was done carefully with sharp scissors, following the lines or marks exactly so that the pieces would fit together properly when sewn. Children in these families, when they were not in school, would have their own small tasks to do, gathering eggs from the henhouse if the family kept chickens, walking slowly across the yard to the small wooden structure where the chickens lived, reaching carefully into the nesting boxes to find the eggs, still warm and smooth, carrying them back to the kitchen in a basket, trying not to stumble or drop them. Or children might be asked to bring in firewood from the woodpile, making multiple trips, carrying a few pieces each time, stacking them neatly in the wood box, their arms held stiffly to keep the wood from dropping, brushing bits of bark and sawdust from their clothes afterward. Older children might help with tasks like churning butter, which involved pouring cream into a tall container with a lid and a wooden handle attached to a paddle inside. Then moving the handle up and down, hundreds of times until the cream separated into butter and buttermilk. This was not difficult work, but it was repetitive and required patience. The same motion over and over, feeling a slight resistance increase as the butter began to form, continuing until the change was complete. On fair days, weather permitting, there might be time to work in a garden if the family kept one, which most families did, growing vegetables and herbs for their own use. Garden work in these times was done by hand, with simple tools, pulling weeds one at a time, loosening the soil around plants with a small hand fork, watering with a watering can that had to be filled at the pump and carried to the garden, poured slowly over the base of each plant. The garden would change slowly through the growing season, tiny seedlings becoming larger plants, flowers forming, and then small vegetables appearing, growing larger day by day, but so gradually that the change was barely noticeable unless many days had passed between observations. Tending the garden meant visiting it regularly, looking at each plant, noting whether it needed water or whether weeds had appeared nearby, but mostly just observing, letting the plants do their growing without interference. Evening would come gradually, the light outside changing from bright to soft to dim, and the family would gather for the evening meal, which might be similar to the noon meal with vegetables and bread, perhaps some preserved meat if the family had it. Everything served on simple plates and eaten quietly, with conversation that was ordinary and calm about the day's small events, about neighbors, about weather, nothing that required excitement or deep thought. After the meal, dishes would be washed again, the same process as in the morning, the same basins of warm, soapy water and clear rinse water, the same careful wiping and drying, the same stacking of clean plates and cups on the shelf where they were kept. The last hours of the evening would be spent in the main room of the house, sitting in chairs or on a sofa if the family had one, doing quiet activities that required little energy. Someone might read aloud from a book or a newspaper, their voice steady and calm, the words flowing one after another without drama or intensity. Others might do handwork, knitting or crocheting or embroidery, their hands moving in familiar patterns, needles clicking softly, yarn or thread sliding through fingers. In the winter months, these evening hours would be spent close to the stove or fireplace, where the warmth was strongest, perhaps with a lamp lit on a nearby table, burning oil and giving off a soft, steady light that was just bright enough to see by. The lamp would need to be filled with oil regularly, the wick trimmed to keep the flame even, the glass chimney cleaned of soot, all simple maintenance tasks that were done without thinking much about them. In the summer months, the evenings might be spent on a porch, if the house had one, sitting in wooden chairs or on steps, listening to the sounds of the evening, crickets and other insects, the occasional distant sound of a neighbor's door closing or a dog barking far away. The air would be cooling gradually, the heat of the day releasing slowly, and there would be nothing to do but sit and be there, perhaps swatting at a mosquito occasionally, perhaps saying a few words about nothing important, or saying nothing at all. Bedtime would come when the light was mostly gone and eyes were growing tired, and family members would rise from their chairs slowly, moving toward bedrooms or sleeping areas, carrying lamps to light their way through darker rooms. Preparing for bed meant simple things, washing face and hands in a basin of water, perhaps brushing teeth with a brush and powder, putting on night clothes that had been worn many times before and would be worn many times again. Beds in these years were often simpler than they would become later, with mattresses stuffed with straw or feathers or cotton, covered with sheets and quilts that had been made by hand, sometimes by family members, sometimes received as gifts or inherited from earlier generations. Climbing into bed meant pulling back the covers, sliding between the sheets, feeling the coolness or warmth of the fabric depending on the season, adjusting pillows, settling into a familiar position. The house would grow quiet, with most lamps extinguished, a last check perhaps of the stove to make sure the fire was safe for the night, doors tested to confirm they were latched, windows checked, and then the slow movement toward sleep, lying in the darkness, listening to the small sounds of the house settling, the slight creaks of wooden boards, the sound of breathing from others sleeping nearby. And the next day would be much the same waking, the same fire in the stove, the same pump handle moving up and down, the same breakfast and dishes and sweeping and all the other tasks that made up ordinary life in these years between 1870 and the early 1900s, when families lived quietly and simply, doing the same things over and over, watching the seasons change, growing older slowly, marking time not with grand events, but with the small, repeated acts of daily life, the things that needed doing, and so were done, again and again, in an endless, gentle rhythm that continued year after year, decade after decade, the same but different, familiar but somehow always new. Ordinary life lived in ordinary ways by ordinary life live, with innary wane in went to bed at night of night, and did it with any in pean with that in it in pween with the pean with the men with the men, and with bin it being with bin within bing and man within with the animal and you but to be and with what to put up put up at go at why do you you to you there that you take a body that I'm work flag up a billion I do if with I will bow without you even with a work you can when my babies and the breed out you war your turd is the she to my two all I sit me with the put with the wind men and will do we can walk in with the and that's this kind of with getting with an hit for what's that woman and